Well, thank you all for coming. It's a humbling experience. I usually talk spontaneously, and today I'm going to try and do it from an outline. And one of the points of this talk is that this phrase, spiritual abode from what it all is a quote. I should have put it in quotes.
Can't hear you.
I should have put it in quotes. This is the phrase that Baba used to describe the center. And it's so this book that's about to come out and this talk is about is reflections on this phrase that Baba coined to describe the center. And the center was actually initiated in 1941 when Baba asked Elizabeth and Narina to find a center. And Baba said about 1941, this year being the most important one in spiritual history, my birthday, falling on February 15th, will not be celebrated publicly or privately. There's many events that I describe that are incredibly significant, but perhaps the most is in this first month, on January 9th, 41, Baba dictated the 7 realities, which is a description of the universal properties of all religious or spiritual minded people can relate to those 7 points. And Baba made a pamphlet of those 7 realities and asked that it be distributed throughout India, Europe, and America. And he appointed 2 people to be in charge of that, and Elizabeth and Narina were appointed for America with the additional request and order for them to find a center to spread his message. So the message at that time was the message of the 7 realities. And this picture was taken, there were a lot of profound things that happened in this year, but this particular picture was taken on July 30th of 1941, just before Baba went into seclusion. And except for bus tours that he did with Elizabeth, 5,000 miles worth in the first part of the year, he was pretty much in seclusion, but he entered into the most strict seclusion on the July 30th. And in that, at that time, it related to Narina because Narina and Elizabeth had been with Baba's since the Nasik ashram. And at the Nasik ashram, and I haven't had this article, but Baba asked them to, the most important rule was to get along. And of course what Baba did, he didn't talk about things. He said, he put 2 people that were very different together on the same task. And that was the way he did his work. So the idea of getting along was no easy task, and it was a spiritual exercise Baba was doing among many things. The transition from Nasik to Mehrabad, where the women eventually were the Eastern women. But having gone through that process, at the end of that process, Baba said of Narina, I have given you the order to find me as God personal. You have found me. Go and tell this to the world. You will hear my voice within. You will hear no other voice. So when Elizabeth and Narina came to America to spread his message, sorry, I shouldn't have done that before. Well, to spread his message, Elizabeth began what were called thought transmission talks, where Narina, sorry, spoke the thought transmission talks. And Baba mentioned at this period of silence, seclusion that he entered into, that he would be breaking his silence inwardly, speaking the word to myself. And Norina, and it just came as a natural association, that breaking of his silence did come through Norina, in the sense that she was speaking Baba's words. And at a critical time in the history of America, by the end of the year, all of the allies were in complete disarray. It was a very dire situation. And the U.S. was, well, Roosevelt was inclined to participate in the war. After the World War I experience, America was very isolationist. And in October of that year, Baba met with Upasani for the last time. And at that time, Upasani told him that all of the powers of the five perfect masters now rest with you. And with that, he also asked Baba to break his silence, but Baba wouldn't do it. He pleaded, he cried about it, but Baba would not break his silence. And so anyway, that ended his last meeting. And then the Blue Bus tour in late November, Baba with Sarosh and others returned the Blue Bus to Myrtle. And Baba, in commenting on the Blue Bus, said that this brought to an end. They actually came back on the 3rd anniversary of the starting of the Blue Bus. And Baba said that the Blue Bus was like, to him, was like Krishna's chariot was to Krishna. And the thing that was interesting, I mean, that's the pivotal war of Krishna's advent, obviously. And World War II is the pivotal working of Baba's during that period. And the thing, there was a lag time of a few minutes, but I said, my God, who was in the Blue Bus with Baba during the war? Elizabeth driving the Eastern Mandali, the Western Mandali, traveling all over India. Now, it's a different suffering than Arjuna's suffering, but it's suffering. And on behalf of humanity and their work. And of course, later it was Elizabeth driving with Mara that participated in the accident in Prague. So both East and West. So it, to me, it was a dramatic push to the role of women in leading Baba's work in this age. I don't know how this came up here, but this, I do know when I did it. This is the cable. We're skipping to 1944, when Elizabeth, again, at the point of the shift, the positive shift in the war, just before D-Day, 2 days before D-Day, she sends a letter offering the property to Baba. And he cables back 3 months later. I often wonder what went through her mind waiting for this response. But 3 months later, I'm happy to find in all your letters about Myrtle Beach everything that I personally and spiritually approve of and sanction. All my lovers should cooperate to make Myrtle Beach the spiritual abode of all, one and all. So the first thing that jumps out is she offered him 800 acres of land at the time. Baba accepted Myrtle Beach twice. He refers to it as Myrtle Beach. And he also, in describing it as a spiritual abode is, of course, home, means home. And a home, the etymology of it, I'm sorry, I like etymology, is to abide. It's waiting. So this is spiritual waiting. It's a place of spiritual waiting. And what are we waiting for? For Baba to dawn in our own hearts. And when we say for one and all, it's interesting, one, the relationship between God and man is one. You know, the only the reality is within each person's heart, and every person's path is unique. So therefore, we can't judge anybody, particularly when Baba says the realization is the balancing of good and bad sense cars. When they come into perfect balance, you have realization. That means if you're a little high on the good or a little high on the bad, you know, you have to do the opposite to bring it in. So when there's no reason to assess whether somebody's good or bad. And in our Christian culture, believe me, I spent most of my life deciding I was bad, you know, or whatever, trying to figure out how to be good. And, you know, it was I remember in the Lord's Prayer, in the 23rd Psalm, I have to start at the beginning in order to get to it. But for His righteousness' sake, I said, geez, even if I do right, it's, you know, it's not even my, you know, I can't take credit for it. So the point that I'm trying to make is that Baba, in describing the Mere Spiritual Center as a place of universality above any isms of Vedantism, Christianity, Islam, being above those things, a place of universality. And also saying that His center is within the heart of each individual. That's where it becomes universal, because it's a personal relationship with God. And when you go on to the center, you go on and you experience Baba's love that's in His home. Just like you go into anybody's home, you feel the quality of the home. Well, to be able to have the ability, anyone that wants to go on the center can go on and experience Baba's love. And Elizabeth and Jane and many other people, Darwin lived way up in Little River, the twins when they came, as soon as they came into Myrtle Beach or in Myrtle Beach, they felt Baba's presence. So whether you know it or not, when you come to Myrtle Beach, you're coming into Baba's atmosphere. And whether you know it or not, it triggers changes. And Erich made an interesting comment about Merazad and Merabad. And that is that Merazad is obviously Baba's home. And Zad means free. You're free in your own home to do as you wish. Merabad he described as a spiritual battlefield where we get work done. And he said Merazad serves as a place where people get a break from that experience that they're having in Merabad. And so he said, if it's up to me, the only changes I'd make in Merazad is to plant more flowers or something. and so Myrtle Beach is an interesting situation in that we have Merazad, Baba's home, but we also have Merabad, his retreat center. And they're co-located. But the thing that and this is the driving force of my whole thing, was I moved here in 1962. I was 18. We lived in Briarcliff, just down from Baba's house. We didn't know anything about Baba. But I had grown up liking silence in nature. When I was 5 years old, I went to a Quaker meeting with my mother for the first time. And I would sit in the silence, and it was only until my brother told me in my 30s, you know, people would get up and speak. I never heard any of that. I tuned into the silence. And also, retroactively, I look back, that coincided with 1949 is when I was 5. That's when Baba requested his lovers to observe silence in preparation for his new life for the month of July. And up until then, in my family, my dad didn't like the hypocrisy. Something happened when he was young. He was a very devout Presbyterian until something happened. And he just didn't like the convention and the social or the hypocrisy or whatever. So he never would go to church. So my mother would take us to the Presbyterian church, which I enjoyed. But we could either go to church or we could stay home and work with my dad, who loved to work with tools. And when I was 4 years old, I worked a 2-man saw with my dad. And cutting down about a 2-3 foot diameter oak tree. And he knew, he said, you just pull. If you push, it'll buckle, you know. So when you really, each person, it sings, you know. So anyway, when I started going to Quaker meeting, that was all I wanted to do at that point. And within the year out, I don't know whether this was the cause of it, but my dad decided he wanted to build our own house. So we bought some property out on the end of Long Island, and we began commuting. And for the next 2 years, we built a house, a summer home, which is made, and this was between 1950 and 1952, just happened to be out of the same wood that the barn is made out of, Becky cypress. We all have these connections. Kitty begins her book that way, you know. And then I moved here in '62, you know, and unbeknownst to me, I'd like to go out in nature. So the first time I came to the center was going over the dunes, because I like to sit there. I'm way off of this topic. Let's see, what is that down? Whether the retreat, let's see. Yeah, this is Darwin. In 1935, Darwin expressed to Baba that he wanted to have a center for Baba. And Baba said, wrote back to him, whether that retreat on earth is established or not, I do really appreciate the spirit of brotherhood and love that has been awakened, and consider it a spiritual retreat already established within, which is much more substantial and real than any earthly home or structure built for the purpose. Now, Elizabeth and Marina in 1938 had a suggestion that wouldn't it be nice to have a universal center to spread his message? And Baba told them, it's a good idea indeed, but by attaching too great significance or giving it too much importance, it develops into a regular organization or system, and I do not want to limit myself or bind myself with any such thing. I create things on a firm foundation and then pull them down. The more I make changes, the more changeless I am. We're all familiar with that. So, now, so we have Darwin's perspective, that what he said to Darwin, that's pointing to the heart, and then the idea to have groups. But what does Baba say about groups? I would like you all to belong to certain groups. Why? Because you can cooperate and tell others about me and share your thoughts. You learn much more than when you remain by yourself. When you listen, exchange thoughts, prayers, my presence is there. Key word, cooperate. It comes up so much in this. So I was, so after that home thing, I want to tell a little bit about my story too, because it bears on the perspective of where I'm coming from. But when I went away, we were very home-centered. My dad had his own business. We worked in his business. We built a house together. We were very home-centered. And, but when I got to high school age, they went on double sessions and I was sent to private school. There I had daily chapel. And on Sundays we had prominent speakers from all the theological schools. I was near Princeton. We had Princeton Theological, Yale Divinity, Harvard Divinity, Union Theological, all these people came. And so I got a wide exposure to religion and religious thought. And I had read the Bible, and my dad, while I said he didn't go to church, he was biblically literate. He had read the whole Bible, and he actually had read the Quran. When I asked him about it, he said, well, I only did it because I wanted to see what all these other millions of people were so interested in. But nevertheless, he read it. And so it was an interesting contrast between my mother and father spiritually. My mother had a very personal relationship with Christ, prayed for people, had healing for people. And I always wanted to have a personal relationship with God, but it was more what she called the mind of Christ outside. So we came to 62. I moved here in 62. In the late 60s, I went in the service where I was trained in Russian, and I actually got stationed in Peshawar, Pakistan, the end of 1967 and all of 68. Peshawar, Pakistan, if you remember, that's where Babajan was buried alive. She was one of the perfect masters of the age. He was buried alive and came back out of the And the people that buried later met her and became her followers.
Hey, Jonathan. Good day.
Good to see you.
Give a shout out.
Yeah. So anyway, you need a patent attorney. I've been using it.
Bless you. Babajan.
Babajan, yeah. So I played golf, so I traveled all over Pakistan playing golf, meeting, and it's an Islamic culture where Christians, about the best job they can get is sweeping streets. I had a caddy who was a Christian. So just another level of experience, but it also coincided with the years of Baba's farm work that I in 68. Of course, I didn't know anything about Baba at that time. But when I came back, I learned transcendental meditation. And I was interested in, my motivation was to expand the heart. It goes back to my Quaker experience. In that silence, you feel the connection with the people that you're with. And so I became a teacher of it, and so I was very involved in it. Then I came home one time, and my mother asked me, because we had always shared on a spiritual level of things, and she said, would you like to go over and meet Elizabeth Patterson and talk about spiritual things? So I said yes. And we went over and met her in Del Ruba. As I recall, I think it was on the porch. But anyway, we spoke, if memory serves, for 3 hours. And when I mentioned about meditation, she said, well, meditation, there's no love in it. And I said, that was, of course, the most important thing to me, you know, so I just had an inherent respect for her, so I said, well, I understand it's impersonal, and we went, it was back and forth, but her thing was always, there's no love in it now, and she didn't say it with any emotion, she just made the comment. And then she proceeded to tell me all these experiences she had with mus, with Baba meeting mus and saliks all over India, whether it was someone living off of cigarette butts in a public restaurant in Calcutta, or a man who, these are the ones that I just remember, that was just a normal-looking, presentable businessman or whatever, and Baba would go over and bow down to him, and the man was wondering, you know, why, whatever. He was just, his experience was natural, he didn't. And so the only other thing I'll mention about it was, I felt some energy in my chest. And I had no context for understanding what it was, but I just noted it. And in my years continuing with TM and I went to Maharishi. Maharishi was not only a teacher of meditation, he was quite an organizational man. He created an international university. And from 1972, when he established that university, by 1970, late 70s or early 80s, it had become an accredited university in Iowa with six PhD programs, mostly in the sciences, including a business MBA, and also a discipline, a PhD program in science and creative intelligence, which revealed his real purpose in coming to the West. And that was, in India, no one was paying true attention to the Vedic tradition. They were more interested in Western, modern scientific knowledge. And so he went to America to legitimize Vedic knowledge in the terms of Western science to come back to India. It's actually a parallel, let's just consider, but Baba talked about India is the most spiritual place, but America has the capacity to lead the world spiritually, and he says, why? Because of the energy that we have here. And that's an example of how it is. India is more spiritual, but through the help of a master, which Baba identifies, they will be able to lead spiritually through that energy and vitality they have. So,
Sorry, what did, you said Baba identified the...
he mentioned that, Baba mentioned that America can lead the world spiritually.
Right.
With the proviso that one of the things that can mess it up is drugs in the youth. That's why he came.
If awakened.
Yeah, if awakened by a master, yeah.
By a master.
Yeah.
He meant himself.
But he met himself. Yeah. He met himself, yes. And so, the,
You and Tia.
yeah. So the other thing that he pointed out, and this happened pretty, again, experientially, he said TM wasn't a religion, and obviously I grew up Christian, but I had a very dear man who was a Brahmin cook. And boy, there are Indian cooks and then there are Indian cooks. And this guy, I had the job at this, I was working in an Ayurveda health center, and I would pick up the doctors and pundits that came in from the airport and bring them out. And then I'd look after their needs, and I was under instructions not to eat with them, eat before I go there. While I go there, having eaten. If you've ever gone to an Indian home when dinner is served and tried not to eat, you know, I wasn't successful. So I said, I'd go there full, and then I'd eat this whole big meal that he would, as Indians want you to do. I said, this meal is so good, and I can eat it. And he said, there's a word for that. It's food that's so good that it creates its own digestion. And so anyway, he was such a dear man that, and I, whatever, because, oh God, there's a number of stories, but he did the sacred thread ceremony, you know, initiated me into that. Well, that was a tremendous source of confusion. And so what happened in the next few months was, through a friend, I learned the rosary. I was meeting, I had contact in a local Benedictine monastery. And when I started doing the rosary, I had the same experience that I had with Elizabeth. So I became a Catholic, and I told the priest that the reason I was doing this was strictly because of the relationship with Mary. And the mind can lead to problems, you know. And so, so I did that, and then the next thing was just after a year or so of doing that, doing both meditation and going to Mass regularly, I gave it all up. I decided I was going to go retire, get some land up in the mountains, and become a recluse. I was 50. And I actually read an article in a local New Age magazine. You want me to say that?
What?
New Age. You want me to?
Don't tell the story of your life,
Oh,
please.
come on.
We want it.
Okay.
Now it's
We're in.
Kendra Road had written an article about Baba's 100th birthday being celebrated at the Mayor Spiritual Center. And my mother was just moving back to Myrtle Beach. So I said, well, I'll call the center and I'll start my time in the forest at the center. So as it turned out, I got there just before Armakithi. And Jane, who was Elizabeth's spiritual sister, I found out later, I tell her what I'm doing. Oh, I've been in a health center, I teach medical. Isn't that wonderful? It's just the most greatest thing in the world, you know. And of course, I had given it up, and she asked me if I would teach someone, and it was a prominent person, and I said, because they had just asked her the day before if she knew somebody who taught meditation. So I said yes, but I was a little ambivalent about it. It turned out that it never transpired. But anyway, that's how everything went away. And when I stayed on the center in silence for the first stay was for 2 months, basically in the Hermitage during the coup when there was a prior reservation. And I found out at that time when I first heard it, because Elizabeth didn't mention who Baba was, but when I heard who Baba was, the first thing, and that it was going to be a place of world pilgrimage, I said, my God, he's created all infrastructure for it already, in terms of Myrtle Beach as a place full of hotels. And that was my first reaction. And I think I started to say, but I didn't finish it. I say that the motive force for this whole flow for me was the fact that when I came here, I told my mother Myrtle Beach felt more like home than any place I lived. That was my gut feeling of being in Myrtle Beach. And so it was the motive force for a lot of this inquiry that I've been on. Where are we at here? So I just wanted to read through just quick the 7 realities. The preamble to the 7 realities: I give no importance to creed, dogma, caste, or the performance of religious rites, but to the understanding of the following 7 realities. The only real existence is that of the one and only God, who is the self in every finite self. The only real love is the love for this infinity, which arouses an intense longing to see, know, and become one with its truth, God. The only real sacrifice is that in which, in pursuance of this love, all things, body, mind, position, welfare, and even life itself are sacrificed. Fourth, the only real renunciation is that which abandons, even in the midst of worldly duties, all selfish thoughts and desires. The only real knowledge is the knowledge that God is the inner dweller in good people and so-called bad, in saint and so-called sinner. This knowledge requires that you help all equally as circumstances demand, without expectation of reward. And when compelled to take part in a dispute, to act without the slightest trace of enmity or hatred, to try to make others happy with brotherly or sisterly love. Yeah, it's there. Sixth, the only real control is the discipline of the senses to abstain from low desires, which alone ensures absolute purity of character. And 7, the only real surrender is that in which poise is undisturbed by any adverse circumstance, and the individual, amidst every kind of hardship, is resigned with perfect calm to the will of God. This is a Christmas card that Elizabeth and Irina sent to Baba in 1944 after they had found and he had accepted the center. And it's the life, the abodes, you know, the abodes obviously refers to Abode and New Orleans here, but it is Myrtle Beach. And I think they have New York City up there, though, too, yes. But obviously that heart thing, I'm sure Bob will love that
It
card.
looks like one of those New Yorker posters. Where
Yeah.
it's like New York City, China, and that's it.
Yeah. So, and this is a statement that Baba made in the barn in 1956. And I'll be coming back to it again with more of it. My center is in the heart of every lover. Every lover with a heart that loves Baba is a center. Whoever, then the second phrase, this is the 4 points that he made. It was this same message about the center being in the heart. He had also given it Andra. And if you know, Hamirpur was his heart, Andra was his mind. And so I think it's true of America that we tend to be dominated by the mind too, so that's why we got this message as well. But, so he points to the heart, and then he says, whoever, this is a caveat, whoever wants to work spreading my message of love and truth absolutely needs a central office and groups of workers who can function from that central office. There is always a need for a group to have a center. So the thing that's interesting about centers is whenever you create something like the circle or whatever it is, you have to have rules, you have a vision statement, you have all these things. And they're a mental conceptual framework that distinguishes you and also says what your vision is. And so as the first thing about the center being in the heart is obviously the heart. When you get into organizations, you get into the area of the mind. And that's fine, the mind needs to serve the heart. The problem is if the mind dominates the heart. And that can happen in organizations. And that was one of the experiences that I got out of all my years being associated with the TM organization. And observing not only the organization, but how Maharishi would shake things up when it got stagnant or stuff like that. He really could shake things up. And the point is that people often, whether they're working for the organization or looking to that organization, treat the organization like it has a heart. They personify it as a heart. And if you personify something as having a heart that doesn't have a heart, you can damage your own heart. And what I learned was that it was important to, in recognizing that, is to relate to the people within an organization as people, not as personifications of the organization. Because if you go to somebody, say at the Gateway or at this office or that office, and you think they're the organization and you have a problem with this aspect or that aspect of the organization, if you approach them on a mental level like that, you force them to be a rule enforcer because they have to, that's their job to uphold that organization. But if you relate like, this is my problem, or what can I do about it, that person is able to respond personally. And by the same token, for people in an organization can find themselves with all this projection on them of becoming rule enforcers. And one of the side benefits is, well, you can feel power, but that's not very satisfying. What's really satisfying is also to have a heart experience. So it really behooves the individual, it's not the problem of the organization. We have the power to relate one-to-one, heart-to-heart, to function cooperatively within organizational structures. And as I said, as Baba says, the organization, for those who want to spread my message of love and truth, serve an important function. But they're not, they can also go awry if they just become social institutions. That's what my dad's problem was. Sorry if I went on too long there. So, and this is the key phrase here. So he says, you can have many such centers. Myrtle Beach is such a center, and it stretches for many miles. I don't know about the 14, but I do know about this. And I spent a lot of time researching. Baba obviously spent time in Yukon Dunes, the longest amount of time, in Myrtle Beach. And he spent it there with his men and women Mandalay. The men Mandalay had their meals out in restaurants. So in 1952, Gustachi's all he ate was ice cream, but they were wandering around Myrtle Beach eating and being here. It must have been quite a thing. But and this was after the accident, so it wasn't an easy experience for them. Although they did go out and do some things. Mara was actually taken to that, got the name of that Austrian horse show, happened to be here, and Baba took her to that. And and then Baba went to, and this was another thing that was I had read that Baba was in seclusion the first 2 weeks when he came in 52. And
It's hard to hear you.
oh, really?
You gotta,
Twist that thing a
Keep
little
the
bit.
microphone right in front of your mouth.
There you go.
it doesn't move, but it's.
Okay.
That's
There
the
you
problem.
So in 1952, Baba got here April 17th, 18th, and he went into seclusion. So I assumed he was holed up, right? It wasn't until Heather's book came out, and in there, in the beginning of the second book, is a description from Mani's diary of how they would go out on excursions. And she describes going to a drive-in movie, to a kiddie show, a fair, an oceanarium, went to Brook Green Gardens. So Mara went to Brook Green Gardens and, in 52. So Baba made himself in that first 2 weeks at home on the center, but he also made himself at home in this area on a personal level. So when he said, I personally approve and sanction, personally and spiritually, this whole area. So that, so then the last point he makes after the heart, the mind, the nature of the center, he says, that there should be cooperation, harmony, and group heads should not try to win over other members from one office or another. Why? What for? When all work for Baba, there should be harmony and cooperation. So back to the Nasik Ashram. Get along. And know that we're all unique paths, we're all on the same thing. That's why we can relate to one another. You know, you may not like everybody, but you can relate to everybody. And so you can love everybody because we're all having that love of God within, awakened within us. I was just one flashback. When I was in school, the biggest phrases that caught my attention was Christ saying, be one with the Father as I am one with the Father. Be you perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. And I thought, the thing that I took from that, I said, well, it must be possible. There must be people that can be that. So Maharishi never claimed to be perfect. Maharishi taught in the name of that Vedic tradition. So that was my quest. And I found it in Baba. Someone who exemplifies experientially that total reality. Now, this is the other, so there's just a few pivotal things. The telegram that Baba sent, this statement that I just read at the barn, and then this is the third one. After the World's Fair that Jane had organized and kind of overseen, Elizabeth wrote to Mani and she said, wouldn't it be nice if Jane and the kids could move on the center? So Baba wrote back and said, yes, that's a good idea. And he also sent out a message around that time inviting families with small children to move on the center. So Tom and Yvonne and Julia Mavers, they responded to that invitation. And that was in process, but everybody just couldn't up and move right away. And then But what happened was, I don't know if it was Medfoot or I was told it was a lawyer that said it's a problem to have private homes on a nonprofit thing. So what happened was the Otts and Jane had to sign life estates where their properties revert to the center. And then for those that weren't able to come on, this was instructions to Elizabeth. There was also letters that were sent to them. But he said, those who wish to make their homes there may build upon the property around the center. This would please Baba very much, as it will serve the purpose of surrounding, as far as possible, the center with homes of close Baba lovers. This will not mean they're being excluded from the center, but rather it will mean, in the truest sense, they're enlarging the center. The boundary is only in law, not in love. So, you know, when we talk about doing it the service at the center, the thing that I got from this was the greatest service we do is to live here. Just by being here. And why is it? In 1954, when Baba gave up the board, he said the need for external connections has ended. He's severing external connections. It's now a matter of interconnections between each individual and Baba, but also among all lovers of God. We have that internal connection. And in keeping with that, Baba has this stated this: the book that I shall make people read is the book of the heart, which holds the key to the mystery of life. Societies and organizations have never succeeded in bringing truth nearer. Realization of truth is solely the concern of the individual. There's a reason we feel lonely sometimes. Feel lonely. Ultimately, you and I are not we, but one. The creation gives us this opportunity to experience love because it's only one reality, and if we experience duality, it's just the motive for us for love to bring it back to the ultimate reality of oneness. So, so in the book, some of the things that I come upon is there's a very intriguing thing. In the last 2 weeks, I've been working on this for 9 years, and at the end of February, I was in communication with the Universal Spiritual Center in Baramangala, and I had written up some stuff and I sent that to them, and it turned out there was a whole history of Baramangala that I wasn't aware of. And just like Elizabeth had given me that saying, oh, love, there's no meditation, there's no love in it. Erich, when I told him that I wanted to go to the inauguration of the Universal Spiritual Center in Baramangala, I said, what do you want to go there for? You know, Baba finished his work there. He left it that was just the scaffolding. It's nothing, you know. So I didn't fight him about it, but I did end up going to it. And I was, Craig Zanner and I were two from Myrtle Beach. The rest was of Westerners were the Sufi group, which must have been 50 people. And it was quite a celebration in terms of, you know, all this music and theater that the Sufis put on. And I had been going through Hamirpur, and I had met all these center heads and people from all over India, and they were all there. And I said, I was thinking to Erich, I said, it may be nothing, but some people think it's something. There were a lot of people there. And what I found out from this book about this history of the center was that Baba did indeed give up the Baramangala Center. He started it in December of '39. April 1st, he abandoned it and rented it out to the army for the duration of the war. But he had, one of the boys that had come to be with him, a young man, and traveled with him for the next 4 years as a close associate on the Blue Bus and various things. Bob had sent him back to be a caretaker of the Barramongla Center, of the central point where he had driven a stake. And in the new life, when he sold the property, that same caretaker purchased the property. Eventually, there was a long story, I won't go into that whole thing, but before that happened, in May of 40, after he had abandoned it, Baba announced, he said, I'm going to establish 12 centers before I break my silence in India. And he listed 6 of them. The 5th and 6th were Mandala and Barramongla, which were associated with this universal scheme of the Universal Spiritual Center. And he went on to Marizad, whatever all 12 are, I'm not exactly sure. The point is that he did say that they would become centers. The interesting thing is both the Mandala Center and the Barramongla Center, which were this scheme of the place for the afflicted, for saints, for mosques, a school to train people. Those 6 departments with a whole site plan, an architectural site plan for both those areas could not be implemented there because the Barramongla Center now, they have a few acres and it's surrounded by an industrial park now. Toyota manufacturing car plant, Ingersoll Rand. In Mandala, they had forgotten about, the trust had forgotten about the property. Most of it was squatters had come in or the property had been sold off. So the unique thing about that center is that Baba had built his samadhi in 38, in 40, he created a duplicate samadhi at the Mandala site. And when Bao was reminded of that, the trust reversed its sanction on not having duplicate replica samadhis built. And so both those centers have their significance. But in reflecting on all this, I really came to the feeling that the scheme of the Universal Spiritual Centers was, like Eric said, representative of Baba's work at the time. Because Deshmukh described at the time in 1939 when this scheme had come out, he said, the twofold purpose of the scheme is to prepare humanity for true brotherhood, which alone can ensure a life of selfless love and intelligent cooperation in social and international affairs. And secondly, to help those on the path to gain God realization. So that first is a general push to elevate humanity. The second has to do with the work he did with Muslim work. And actually when this work in Mandala was being done, Baba said he couldn't be bothered with it because he had to concentrate on the mosque, because that was the more important work in 1941. He should concentrate on working with the mosque. So at that same time, that same public talk in Mandala, Narina emphasized that the nature of work of Sri Meher Baba has been made clear to us by himself when he says, I have come to teach, not to teach, but to awaken. Sri Meher Baba, so the point is, it did make me think about what Erich had said, and then I realized, while everybody still thinks in terms of what does that Universal Spiritual Center mean for Myrtle Beach, and I have a tape, Elizabeth on tape, saying, well, those things could be, it might be, but Phyllis, it's on a recording with Phyllis Frederick, he said, we do have a hospital. And the hospital was actually started by the women of Myrtle Beach. In 1951, they started fundraising for it. And Baba, when he went to Brook Green Gardens in '52, asked to see it. And the only thing I confer is that the property had been chosen, and they drove around that property, which is off of 79th Street, where the Grand Strand Memorial Hospital originally was. But Elizabeth said it took a long time to raise the money, and it was only in '58 that Burroughs and Chapin donated the land, and the hospital was built. So she said, so it doesn't necessarily mean that it has to happen on the center. But the other thing that I noticed was there's not the Sufis, not their spiritual center, not Barramangala, nor Mandala is the Universal Spiritual Center scheme incorporated into a charter. And so whether the fact that he called it a scheme is interesting, because it could represent that symbolized the work he did in that most significantly spiritual year of 1941 to begin the preparation of humanity for sin.
He became preparation for what?
For the rest of his work. And you know, that last picture of Baba, of the chase photo, when you look, did I mention in that first picture? See, this is Baba in 1956, after he left the center, after he gave that talk about the center being in the heart, being cooperative, and dealing with the difficulties between groups. Baba goes to Washington, D.C., and these Chase studio pictures were taken on July 30th. That's the same date as the one in 41 was taken. On this date, it just so happened that a bill had gone through Congress and came to Eisenhower's desk. July 30th, the day that the motto that had been on our money became the motto of the country. It was signed, "In God We Trust" became the motto of the United States, and Baba showed up. And he looks, this is really America's photo. This is for America. And the earlier photo, I don't think I pointed it out, but when I first saw this photo, it wasn't a good copy, and I saw it as Baba looking to the future. And when I got a high-resolution copy, and you take a look at the pathos, the suffering that's in his face at this time is palpable.
What is palpable? We
The
can't.
suffering.
Suffering.
The suffering. So we're all perfect love is sweet suffering. Everything takes off. So if any of you have any questions, yeah.
I'm sort of surprised that you didn't comment on the first words of the charter of Mayor Spiritual Center Incorporated in this talk, because there is specific reference to centers in Myrtle Beach in the United States. Would you like to comment on that?
Actually, that's in the book. There's lots of things that weren't in the book, that are in the book that aren't in. Yes, I can,
What is the significance to you of the fact that the charter, which was a 1959 charter, very, very clearly does not just refer to the 500-acre site that we think of now as the mayor's. What's your take on it?
Well, when I first went on the board, that was my first thing. I had two things that struck me. One was that I read the charter and I said, we're only really paying attention to the first point in the charter. And the first point in the charter basically says that it's dedicated to the name of Mayor Baba and his spiritual purposes and his teachings without supplanting the religious beliefs of others for rest and renewal of the spiritual life. That's maybe not exactly right, but about it. Then it goes on, the next 2 points talk about the center being the central headquarters for America, the centers throughout America, and it's very detailed, giving it the authority to establish centers, to fund centers, to appoint management, all sorts of things. then it can also donate funds for various philanthropic reasons. But the other thing that was approved at the same time was the 4 points of Elizabeth, which Elizabeth described as an amplification of the charter and the present plan for the center. And that's where it mentions a retreat, the center being a retreat, place for discourses, and so on and so forth. So, my first response was we need to establish what is the nature of the central headquarters and these other centers. Because I think the first person of prominence that I mentioned it to, I think it brought up the Catholic, the problems of, that can come with hierarchical organizations, and they just kind of didn't want to go there. But basically, this aspect of homes, see, the idea that the paradigm of home, and forgive me ladies, but I mean, no one creates a home better than women. And, I mean, men are okay when they're on their own.
I don't think you'll offend anyone.
Yeah. And that quality of the heart that women have. And Baba, in this Advent, through creating his 2 homes, which incidentally were occupied at the same time. Baba took up a residence at Marizot at the same time Elizabeth received the promise of the property and began building on the center. And he had said a year earlier that I want to come and take up residence with Mera, Mani, Nehru, Goher, and Balu. And he did that on April 11th. April 10th was Easter Sunday. And I'll just throw out a teaser. On April 10th, President Roosevelt, who was in dire health, came to Hopcaw, which is down by Georgetown, spent the next month here, including after his health recovered, a drive up to Myrtle Beach and back. And during that time, the King and Queen of Norway, the Prime Minister of Australia, General Abrams, everybody came here because they were in preparation for for D-Day. So that took place out of here. Winston Churchill also visited here just after he lost his power in '31 and began a tour to caution America about what was happening in Germany. And he also came at the invitation of Bernard Baruch in July because he had an accident and he came here to recover. And so Myrtle Beach, this connection with the war is a profound connection. And when we talk about the center stretching for many miles, Baba has all these connections with all those places. So getting back to so to me, the contribution of this idea of Baba's home and the importance in Myrtle Beach of being a spiritual abode for one and all, where we all have the opportunity and the freedom to create in our home the atmosphere that we like. Everybody's home's different. You don't have, there's no prescription to how you live in your own home. Whether you're Christian or Jew or whatever, you observe in your own home the way you like. At the same time, you understand that when you go to your place of worship, you make certain compromises to conform to the rules and the thing of that particular denomination or that church or synagogue or whatever. And so, in terms of universality in home, when you go to Marizot, you can go up Exclusion Hill, you can be in Mondale Hall, you can do whatever you want to do in Europe, and nourishing your relationship inwardly. When you go to programs, you conform with those rules. So, and as I said, Baba called for both. So the centers, it's company of saints. It's important to be able to share with other people on the path. So he's basically, I'm just saying in this idea of home is whether it's our center or a center in Chapel Hill where they meet in homes, or there's all sorts of, during the New Life, Baba had wanted people to follow his orders, that they could form organizations, that they could have a manager, they could have a committee, they could appoint a director. He didn't care what organizational structure it had. So my point is that the emphasis on homes and the uniqueness of each person's heart and each person's home, this paradigm of home as a place which is a haven, a safe haven from the troubles of humanity and whatnot, where you can retire and reflect and strengthen your own inner life. And even further, the home, the center within your own heart. But that this is, Bob is pointing to this as the paradigm that empowers universality. So that when we come together, we're not dependent on an organization. We go to the organization as an aid. The mind serves the heart. And so the center, in being the central headquarters, being Baba's home, and it exemplifies that the importance of home and what it empowers us to do, and frees organizations to provide the services they want by people who are getting stronger and stronger in terms of their own relationship with God and their own heart. That's the really enabling thing. As he said in that last thing, it's not organizations that do that. It's God within their own, people's own heart. And so the other takeaway from that is that in the long term, and I don't know when it's going to happen, but when the center will be a place of pilgrimage, Baba said so, and when large numbers of people come, 52, 56, and 58, most of the people stayed in the town, in hotels, and motels, maybe homes. But that atmosphere is, Baba's atmosphere is there, and it extends as more lovers of God are here. It extends out, and it becomes an example to other centers to use that model of being a home, facilitating that kind of sharing in whatever format is comfortable to people in that area to create. I feel like I'm dwindling down. You got the idea. Yeah. Do you have a question?
No, I was going to J-Bob.
J-Bob.